it's like a Marvel Universe version of the US government right now. Like, you're like, what? Why are we in this movie instead of in an actual, real political world? We are speaking at a moment when the federal government has shut down over Congress's ability to even keep the government running.
Where is Congress right now when some people say we need it most?
I think Americans do genuinely believe that if Trump says it's in the Constitution, it is, and if it isn't, it isn't. That the state is me, right? That is the kind of absurd political decay that we're in the midst of.
Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Matt.
I'm Anushka, and the US government has shut down, but I have not.
Of course you haven't. I wonder if you've noticed the shutdown where you are. I mean, lots and lots of people are. If you're trying to get into a national park, you're going to notice the shutdown because it'll be closed, for instance. And we'll be talking about the shutdown later, but we've got lots of stuff coming up, haven't we?
Yeah, we're going to be talking to the most revered political historian of her time, Jill Lepore, about all of this. She's going to join us later. But first, I think we do need to focus on what is happening here at the moment.
Well, there's loads, right? So there's the shutdown. And just to reflect briefly on the week that we've had already, on Monday, President Trump announced his 20-point plan for peace in the Middle East, including Gaza. We'll talk about that. On Tuesday, there was this extraordinary, unprecedented gathering of the top brass of the world's mightiest military in the history of military existence, summoning them to the Marine base in Quantico for World War III? No, for a war against FLAD. We'll talk about that. But let's start with the shutdown. So what have you noticed? How does it feel? What are people saying around you in Washington about the shutdown?
Well, I think it's worth saying, first up, that shutdowns are things that are threatened every year in the US. I do think this one is different, and we'll talk about why. And there are lots of things that you don't notice. In fact, even some of the museums, Matt, are very much open because we've already been down trying to film where they're closed. And it turns out they can stay open for a few more days. But look, in Washington, D.C., perhaps more than anywhere else, I think you do feel it because the biggest impact is for federal workers. 750,000 expected to be furloughed. A lot of those federal workers live here in D.C. And the reason I think it feels different this time is the rhetoric we're getting from Donald Trump, the idea that he could go further, that he could use this as an excuse to not just furlough federal workers, but to sack a number of them. I've not been here for a shutdown before. It's a story that it obviously doesn't affect people in the UK hugely. So it doesn't get hugely reported in the UK, but it's totally dominant here across all the media this morning.
I think we should also explain just what it means. If you say shutdown in America, everyone knows what you're talking about. But essentially what it means for those who don't know is that the Congress, the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress cannot agree on what funds the functioning of the federal government going forward. And, this needs to have a proper majority. In the Senate, crucially, it needs a majority of 60 votes, a so-called supermajority. And you can only get that supermajority if the Democrats or a certain number of Democrats vote with the Republicans.
That was great, Matt. How often have you covered this?
Well, literally half a dozen times. And the first time I covered it, it seemed like we were at the edge of an abyss, the end of the world. The federal government shuts down. What are we going to do? Forget about parks and, visiting museums in Washington. It was about, checks being, social security checks being issued by the government, which is very serious because lots of people rely on them. Millions upon millions of people rely on them. So that would have been delayed. I mean, obviously, military expenditure and federal police expenditure and deployment is exempt from that. But there's an awful lot of stuff that gets covered by the federal government, the biggest expenditure government on planet Earth. I'm assuming bigger even than China. And this stuff just doesn't get covered. And the last time we had a shutdown, which was 7 years ago under Donald J. Trump, it lasted for, I think, 6 weeks over the Christmas period. And you do notice things gradually, changing, not happening, the wheels of government grind to a halt. But crucially, Anushka, this time round, there is a very important sort of existential political calculation at play here. So if you remember, in March, just after Donald Trump was inaugurated, there was another threat of a shutdown, and it was averted because Chuck Schumer, who's the Democrat Senate minority leader in the Senate, together with 9 other senators who were Democrats, decided to vote with the Republicans to keep government going, to prevent the shutdown. The firestorm that erupted in the Democratic Party against him for doing so was extraordinary. Schumer the traitor, Schumer the sellout. He's obviously had a conversion on the road to the next shutdown, which has just happened, because he's voted, together with those other Democrats, to shut the government down. This is based on the calculation that it's going to be, that they will reap the rewards of shutting the government down, and that Donald Trump will be blamed for it. But it's a massive risk, because it's equally possible, and this is obviously Trump's calculation, that the Democrats will be blamed for it come the midterm elections. And he might also use this, by the way, as an excuse, as he has threatened to sack hundreds of thousands of federal workers.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. That's the kind of most significant bit for me, what he actually does on that, whether he uses it in that way. But that blame game has already completely erupted. I was actually, walking around the Capitol building yesterday trying to speak to politicians who were involved in this. And they were saying things like, it's not our fault, Democrats were saying, because we have been waving our hands essentially for weeks to try and have a negotiation about this. And the Republicans have said that they don't want to have a negotiation. The Republicans are now saying just vote to pause this, then we can have the negotiation. And they're saying it's a bit late. I mean, the crux of it is that because of that supermajority that's required, this is the one opportunity a year for a minority party to actually exert some influence. The Democrats are particularly focused on cuts to Medicaid, which is medical care for some of the poorest people in America, and other things around healthcare. And so they're holding out on signing off the entire budget because of that. Donald Trump's response is to say this is all about giving free healthcare to illegal aliens. The group that he's talking about don't actually qualify for some of the benefits that Democrats are trying to hold. One interesting person I bumped into was Senator Chris Murphy.
Oh, yes.
Very outspoken from Connecticut.
We like Chris Murphy, yes.
Yeah.
He gives
had already
good copy.
Stood up.
Yeah.
He gives good copy. He'd already stood up in the chamber and he'd made this argument that it was not his responsibility to vote for this kind of authoritarian crackdown on democracy that we were seeing from Donald Trump. I mean, when I bumped into him, he sort of gave a slightly more measured answer, which was what he was doing was exactly what you were talking about, the blame game, that this is the Republicans' fault, whilst they're saying it's the Democrats' fault. It will be interesting to see what the public think of this. And also when it starts to affect the public, if it goes on for some time, that will become more and more acute.
But also it goes to the deeper point, which we'll obviously put to Jill Lepore, our guest, in a minute, the deeper point of the nature of power and governance in the era of Donald Trump. So the suspicion, I think quite rightly, is that Donald Trump wants to bolster his executive powers as a president even more than any previous president has done, by governing with these, emergency declarations and decrees, these, presidential missives that are basically signed by a Sharpie pen. He's done an awful lot of that. We'll talk about that as well. But also sidelining Congress. And rightly, the Democrats and even some Republicans, ever so quietly in the dead of night, are saying the Constitution is all about Congress making the laws and essentially running the country, but the chief executive, the president, overseeing that running, making sure that Congress doesn't get out of hand. Well, the exact opposite has happened. And frankly, Congress has not really been there to provide the checks and balances it is supposed to provide for a president who is accused by the Democrats and suspected by some quiet Republicans of trying to rule more like a monarch than a Republican president with a small r. And I think, and so this goes to the very heart of who governs the republic, who's got all the power. And just briefly, I mean, Schumer back in March was saying, well, if we vote to shut down the federal government, in other words, if we vote against this emergency budget measure, we will have no say in how Donald Trump uses his increasingly authoritarian powers in order to sack people, or corral the federal agencies to his will. And at least by allowing the thing to continue, well, Congress carries on with some kind of role. But frankly, it's a losing argument. And the Democrats are caught between their very angry base, their own party political foot soldiers, are saying, hang on a minute, you've got to stand up to Donald Trump. Don't be such wusses. Don't roll over to Trump. And the general electorate that might well blame them for what is about to happen.
All of which has some echoes of the challenges facing the Labour Party right now. I was watching from here to see Keir Starmer try to walk that thin line. And yeah, the Democrats seem to have a very similar and perhaps somewhat amplified calculation to do. Let's just, if you're happy, talk about Gaza for a bit, because obviously we've had this situation this week. I was at the White House on Monday, where we got the comprehensive
that was
peace plan.
that was a big moment, wasn't it, on Monday? And you watched it all in the Oval Office.
I did not watch it in the Oval Office.
Not you weren't in the Oval Office.
It was happening while we were on air, Matt.
Oh, really?
So I had to be standing in the outside area of the White House talking down the barrel to Channel 4 News, because it was happening as I actually had to decide whether to go into this press conference or not. And I was standing there, really wanted to go in to watch the moment, try and catch Donald Trump's eyes with a question. And I was making that calculation that we often do. And I thought there's a chance that I then won't be able to be on air during Channel 4 News.
He was looking for you, Anushka.
They didn't take a single question, either him or Netanyahu. And look, I'll talk in a bit about what I think the reaction has been here, but just tell me, I mean, you've been following this for so long. What was the reaction in Israel and Gaza?
Whenever I hear something, like someone like Donald Trump say on a Monday, as he did, this is a new plan, it's a 20-point plan. And it bats away some of the crazy ideas, like there won't be annexation of the West Bank, there won't be annexation of the Gaza Strip, there'll be no new Israeli settlements inside the Gaza Strip, we're going to withdraw Israeli troops, etc., etc. And this is some sort of path towards Palestinian self-determination, as the plan says, and Palestinian statehood. The inner optimist that is still just about got a pulse says, yippee, finally a bit of a breakthrough. Why not? Donald Trump, he likes to throw spaghetti against the wall, but maybe this noodle has actually stuck. And then, of course, and then you hear Netanyahu, who looked a little bit, I thought, ashen-faced and approved the plan through gritted teeth, because, of course, he's got to sell this stuff to his own cabinet, as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir first and foremost. And then you look at the detail and you realize that although it's 20 points, there are literally dozens of points that are really fuzzy. And then I spoke to people in Israel, first of all. We had a former brigadier general who was the commander of the Gaza battalion when they had one, a permanent one, who was very close still to Netanyahu. And he said, hang on a minute, Matt Frei, this does not mean a Palestinian state. We did not sign up to that. This does not mean the withdrawal of Israeli troops. We did not, from Gaza, we did not sign up to that. And suddenly you think, well, hang on a minute, there's a fundamental disagreement here. And then you talk to people in Gaza, as I did, or indeed to sort of senior Palestinians, including one who was one of the chief Palestinian negotiators for the Oslo Agreement. And he said, look, this is full of holes. There's no way they can agree to this stuff. Although it's a kind of starting point, it's so watered down and wishy-washy. It's kind of where we were years ago. And it doesn't really solidify the one thing that needs to be solidified from a Palestinian point of view, which is a credible, viable pathway to self-determination and statehood, as recognized by the British government just last week, that the Israelis will respect. There's nothing to guarantee any of that. So you're back to a kind of version of the Abraham Accords, and we know how that ended. Everyone in the Gulf was happy and the Israelis were happy, but the Palestinians weren't.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that the exact phrase you've just said, a credible pathway to self-determination and statehood, was literally in the 20 points. Netanyahu stands up in the White House. He accepts this agreement, which we can both see. Point 19 includes that pathway to statehood. He, of course, doesn't take any questions, which a bit like when you were in Alaska with Putin and Trump, the first signs were there that this wasn't quite going to work. And we both knew it, Matt, because both of us were in New York for the UN General Assembly. We listened to Netanyahu on the stage there. I mean, did that sound like a man who's open to the idea of a future statehood for the Palestinian people? He said his argument was that it would be like giving Al-Qaeda a state a mile from New York. And he was talking about Palestinians at that point, not about Hamas specifically. So immediately you think, okay, there are problems here. Then on the other side, there was, the Arab countries seemed happy with it, or so Donald Trump said. But behind the scenes, reports here suggesting officials were absolutely furious because Netanyahu had managed over 6 hours on Sunday with Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, to edit it, and in particular to edit the timetable of a withdrawal from Israel. Of course, what Donald Trump will do is to blame Hamas if this doesn't work, but clearly there are lots of problems in there. I had this fascinating chat before it actually happened with a guy called Aaron David Miller. He's a Middle East analyst. For many years, he was a negotiator on the Middle East for Republican and Democratic administrations. And I said to him, are you optimistic? And he was like, I just don't deal with optimism and pessimism in this, particularly as this war's grinding on into its third year. He said there's not been a single consequence for either side imposed by either the Europeans, the Americans who could actually do it, or the Arab countries. And he basically said that the most hopeful he had ever been on Palestine and Israel was in 2000. And then the gap was the size of a Grand Canyon. And it's only got wider since. And he said every single comma, every single line is now going to be argued about. And so he didn't say pessimistic, but I have to say that was the tone I felt.
I just would add one thing. I mean, for Trump to have gone as far to the mainstream on this, because broadly speaking, these rough outlines of his 20-point plan have been around for a very, very long time. For Trump to get away from Mar-a-Lago-on-Sea, which was his vision of Gaza, when he first came to power, for him to say very clearly to the Israelis, you cannot annex the West Bank, which is what many Israeli cabinet members and quite a few members of the public were fantasizing about. That's quite important and shouldn't be underestimated. He's no longer on the wacky fringe of this. He's gone to the mainstream, although I'm sure he hates that word. The measure to which this thing is unacceptable to the Palestinians will be seen by if it's approved in the Israeli cabinet by the extremists. If they can go along with this, even though it overtly says you cannot annex the West Bank, then they will have to smell something very fishy. The final point is this. The bloke they had brought out of, Middle Eastern retirement, as it were, who's dusted off occasionally for great things, one Tony Blair, our former prime minister. Of course, on paper, it looks good. Right? Blair, who solved, the Good Friday Agreement, Blair, who, worked in the Middle East after he was prime minister, tried to, cobble together some kind of follow-up to the Oslo Accords. Blair knows what he's talking about. He's respected by Palestinians and by Israelis and especially by the Gulf states. Well, when I asked a senior Palestinian yesterday about Blair, his response was, disastrous idea. Let him stay at home. We don't want Blair. And that is an opinion that is echoed not just amongst Palestinians, a broad spectrum of them, but also in his own Labour Party by Labour backbenchers, who were asked about this at the Liverpool conference. So I don't know what, if Blair is the key to this, what we're basically talking about is a broader version of the Abraham Accords.
I mean, it is just worth just on that. So the idea is Trump obviously is chair of the Board of Peace, and then Blair as one of the committee members. And so what I did yesterday was just poured over polling. I've been talking to polling company Gallup about a number of things, and they've done polling both of Israeli and Palestinians and also of Americans on all of this. And I was trying to think, what will people make of Trump and Blair? And approval ratings among Palestinians. And I have to say, they can only poll at the moment people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They can't get into Gaza. But nevertheless, approval ratings for the American administration and leadership are at 7% at the moment. And then I was saying, well, how can I try and understand what they might think of Blair? And what we did was we looked back at 2007 when Tony Blair was in his final year as UK Prime Minister, and disapproval for the UK leadership at the time was 81%. It was the highest it had been, I think, and has been ever since, which was when he was leader. So that, but just on one slightly just attached point to that is American attitudes have shifted on Israel quite heavily. There is still more sympathy towards Israelis than Palestinians, but the numbers have closer than they have ever been before. And for the first time in Gallup's polling history with this, sympathy with the Israelis since October the 7th is below 50%. I think it's reached 33% for Palestinians. And Donald Trump is the one person in the world who has the power to influence Benjamin Netanyahu, because for any Israeli prime minister, that relationship with America is so important at home. he was pretty angry, at least outwardly. I don't know whether he really knew or not about the Qatar strike. And as you say, he has stopped the annexation announcement of the West Bank. So it does still stand with Trump. But chillingly, I thought on Monday, Donald Trump made absolutely clear, if Hamas don't agree to this, Benjamin, you've got my back to go as far as you want to go. And that was really scary.
They've already leveled the place. 80% of it is rubble. They've already killed 67,000 people. I mean, there's not much else they can do when it comes to unleashing hell that they haven't done already. Anushka, I don't know about you. The thing that really got me interested this week and raised a few eyebrows on my head and a few other heads was this unprecedented gathering of the top brass, hundreds of them, of the world's mightiest military in Quantico, the Marine base south of Washington, D.C. We all thought it might be some preparation for World War III, but in fact it was, drum roll, what was it, Anushka?
Fat shaming military generals. So essentially they bring hundreds in, including military, leaders from the Middle East. At the moment, were they talking about Israel, Gaza? They certainly were not. And then I tuned in. I mean, I have to say, I did wonder if it was going to be a bit of a damp squib. I mean, there was some stuff in there which was interesting. Obviously, the optics of it, somewhat North Korean, although they probably want us to talk about that. So let's not too much. But Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, as he is now called, on stage. And then I was like, he suddenly starts talking about fat generals. I was like, what are you going on about? His argument was basically like, if you're fat, you can't be the leader in a military setting. You need to be doing personal training every day. I do personal training every day. Yeah. We're going to make sure that you do. I mean,
he's pretty ripped, that Pete Hegseth. He is pretty ripped. Amazing six-pack.
Donald Trump is not ripped. Wants to be a bit more isolationist, on the world. So when he changed his, his department to the Department of War, I did think, oh, that's funny because he doesn't want to be involved in wars. But the sort of amazing bit is when he talked about that in the room, and he was talking about not a war with other countries, but a war with the enemy within. And he basically openly said, I want you lot to go into American cities, where we're going to put in the National Guard and so forth. And that could be your training. And look, in weeks and weeks to come, I think we're going to discuss this a lot, but it is pretty chilling to hear a president say that. The New York Times best-selling author of These Truths and Now We the People, which focuses on the Constitution, is with us. Jill Lepore, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to speak with you.
You obviously write, and I love this, about the views of the women around some of the men.
Shockingly.
More from the women, please, who drew up the Constitution, including Abigail Adams, the wife of John, of course. He doesn't need a surname. and she wrote this one line, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Can I just start with that? Is that an idea to you that is borne out through American history? And we're going to get to this, of course, and then again today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea on which the United States is founded, right? That's the notion that tyranny is inevitable without restraints on power. And that's why we have a written constitution, unlike England, that, the idea that we should write down the rules and constrain the power of our newly elected federal government. The states did the same thing. And Adams's point in writing to her husband was, well, we forgot one really important kind of power, which is private power, the tyranny of husbands over their wives and over their children in private life. And indeed, just given the nature of 18th century political thought, women and children are left out of those protections. They don't have rights. There is no remedy for the abuse of power within the domestic sphere. And I think it's just important to remember people complained about that. Women complained about that at the time. That's not an insight of feminists in the 1970s. That's an insight of women in the 1770s.
Extraordinary and incredibly important. I mean, not just Abigail Adams, so many women who you talk about.
There's quite a bit of evidence that women were deeply concerned about the consequences of a new framing of the very premise of government, which left women out, did not regard women as persons under the law.
Jill, I mean, I lived in America for 11 years and my kids went to American schools and they were all, brought up to revere the American Constitution. And, we would hear the Pledge of Allegiance. I think it was a Monday morning kind of echoing through our streets. you really worship these parchment papers on which, the greatest Republican experiment in history is based. But I wondered if the founding fathers had ever reckoned with someone like Donald Trump, who may not have read the Constitution, maybe he has, we don't know, but who doesn't seem to be respecting the niceties of it, to put it mildly. Because at the end of the day, it is a kind of agreement amongst, for want of a better term, gentlemen farmers, at the end of the 18th century to divide power, to get away from the British monarchy as much as possible. And 250 years almost after you celebrated your departure from our great monarchy, you've got a president who wants to behave like one.
It is one of the darker ironies of the course of American history that the very form of executive power that the U.S. Constitution was devised to constrain, restrain, prevent is now shadowed by it. Did they anticipate that? Absolutely. And mostly because they were students not only of British politics, they weren't actually that concerned about the king. They were really concerned about Parliament, but they were students of history. And it is a moment in time that I think we've almost forgotten, that when statesmen, and I use the term advisedly, it was crucial to study history, ancient and modern history, in order to understand how power works, what rights are, what to expect of, what they would have called human nature. They also had this, I think, kind of wonderfully Newtonian understanding of politics. They thought that they were applying what Alexander Hamilton called the science of politics to modern political questions. That, yes, the ancients had, back to Plato, had brilliant understandings of the nature of power and how systems of rule would naturally decay into forms of tyranny without any check against them. And they appreciated that wisdom and they valued it. But they lived in a highly scientific age in which, after Newton's optics and Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity, they believed that all of not just the physical world, but all of human experience could be deduced according to natural laws, so that they could devise a constitution that would be an intricate, perfect machine, like with the perfect balancings of the gears and movements of a watch or a clock, that would act to constrain that natural tendency of power to corrupt, of power to become tyrannical. And so they thought they were writing a constitution where someone like Trump could never gain the kind of power that Trump has now gained, because they had devised the thing so perfectly to break that kind of acquisition of power.
The rules, respect the norms. And if a guy like Trump comes along and doesn't respect it, then all those finely devised, mechanisms are really for naught.
I don't know that I would go so far as for naught. I mean, there is a reason that Americans really cherish our Constitution and the stability that it has provided. A lot of Americans believe the U.S. Constitution is responsible for American prosperity, American experience. There are a lot of commitments to veneration of the Constitution from many quarters. I think they tend to overlook the many ways in which the Constitution has failed, not least of it obviously was not able to avert a civil war over how to end slavery. And I think Americans tend not to really pay attention to just how significant the amendments of the Constitution have been to realizing its initial promise. But exactly as you say, I'm not going to dispute, it does depend on people's belief in constitutionalism. Madison always said, these, even the Bill of Rights, these things would be mere parchment barriers. If someone wants to ignore the Constitution and they have the power to do so and they have an army behind them, that is the fragility of constitutionalism. So the question, in the United States today, exactly as you suggest, is the Constitution still operating?
So what is it, do you think, that has allowed this to happen right now? What is it around the institution? What did they fail perhaps to do to not entirely close the gaps? And I just also want to ask you about this thing that I find really interesting as someone. I'm really new to the US. I've just moved here to do the job that Matt did for many years before. I watch this debate over free speech at the moment. Those on the right, they argue as if they believe in the Constitution above all else, right? That's what they say. And then they use those same arguments to attack, absolutely core parts of that Constitution.
Yeah, maybe the framers just weren't cynical enough. You sometimes you sort of look around like, wow, people, there's this, the degree of hypocrisy on all sides is really extraordinary. I mean, there were some structural deformities from the beginning, and I think we see the long-term consequences of those now. One of which is that if you're going to write a constitution down, which was an innovation, right, so that it could be transparent, people could refer to it. Well, you have to have a mechanism to change it because things are going to change, and you actually need to be able to change it in an orderly way, in a peaceful and democratic way. And that mechanism here is the formal amendment process, which turns out to not really work very well. So almost immediately, there's a kind of corruption in a weakness in that balance that's supposed to be in the Constitution, whereby, well, then the Supreme Court steps in and it says, okay, the Constitution needs to change, we'll change it. We'll just read it a little bit differently. So for most of American history, the Constitution is not really amendable by formal amendment. Instead, the court gains more and more power. And it is a really unusual, I think people outside the United States have a hard time understanding why it is that, in my lifetime, nominations to the Supreme Court are just this huge political controversy every time they come around. They'll be, back to the 1980s when a Yale Law School scholar named Robert Bork was nominated by Ronald Reagan to the court. There was this huge campaign, television ads against him. The hearings were televised. People were really obsessed with it. Or, your listeners might remember the Clarence Thomas nomination controversy in the 90s, where Anita Hill came forward with allegations of sexual harassment, or more recently, Brett Kavanaugh. We're living in a world here where there have been death threats, like credible death threats against Supreme Court justices, at least one seemingly attempted assassination. Our Supreme Court justices go on speaking tours. They write memoirs. They're celebrities. This is a complete deformity of what a justice system is meant to do, right? The Supreme Court is meant to be completely outside and immune to public opinion and the popular will. But if you think about the forces that drove Donald Trump to power, and also really buttressed the rise of Barack Obama, the 90s kind of in the US, the sort of lifestyles of the rich and famous, everyone becomes a celebrity. The only source of political power is fame. And then the way that is worsened by social media in the 2000s. We sort of live in a world where we have yielded the idea that the people can expect their leaders to abide by the Constitution to a popular culture world in which our leaders are celebrities. They're celebrity buffoons. We know the names of their wives and their children. The idea that anyone is in good faith acting responsibly with regard to constitutionalism and the rule of law is something I don't think most Americans even believe anymore. Even though I would say, I do believe that people in the federal judiciary are acting in good faith, and I may disagree with their decisions, but it's a weird, it's like a Marvel Universe version of the U.S. government right now. Like, you're like, why are we in this movie instead of in an actual real political world?
Because we have a president who's a TV producer. No, that's a facile answer. I want to ask you, Jill, whether is the reason why so many things that are really important to the way Americans live their lives, and Roe v. Wade, which was overturned by the Supreme Court, is a prime example, the right to have an abortion. Because in most other democracies, that kind of important stuff is decided not by a Supreme Court, but by Parliament or by Congress. Has the Supreme Court stepped in where Congress was unable to act or to decide or to legislate? And where is Congress right now, when some people say we need it most?
Well, part of the problem of the deformity of our constitutional system and the separation of powers is that Congress is effectively useless. It can do nothing. I mean, we are speaking at a moment when the federal government has shut down over Congress's ability to even keep the government running, which does seem like the season finale of a really bad TV show.
Except it happens every 7 years.
It keeps happening. I don't mean to belabor it, but like, really, you're not wrong to say it's a TV produced set of crises that we're in the midst of. The way our system of laws works is that fundamental rights are guaranteed in the Constitution, and they can't be overturned by Congress, and they can't be violated by the states. We have the system of federalism. So in 1965, when the Supreme Court considered the argument that bans on birth control in the state of Connecticut were unconstitutional, it agreed with that claim and said there is in the Constitution a right to privacy. The words right to privacy is not in the Constitution, but famously the Supreme Court said you could find them in the kind of shadow between the letters of other words, like in the penumbra of the Constitution, you could locate a right to privacy. And it's on that basis that reproductive rights became constitutional rights, including the right to an abortion in 1973 in Roe v. Wade. So the reason for rights seekers to go to the court is because Congress was not going to pass such a law. And that is always a tenuous decision, right? Anything that the Supreme Court does, what the Supreme Court giveth, the Supreme Court can taketh away. So, another route would be to go for a constitutional amendment, which the Supreme Court cannot overturn. But historically, in the 20th century, people on the left have gone to the court instead because the court has been liberal. The court is conservative now. And so the court is undoing. So in 2022, the court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision and said, oh, we were wrong. There is no right to privacy in the Constitution. They didn't go that far, but essentially there is no right to an abortion in the Constitution. They didn't overturn the birth control decision, although they may well yet do that. So you see the consequences of not having sought out a constitutional amendment to constitutionalize that right. And you're absolutely right. In other countries, it doesn't work this way. But we're kind of stuck with that at the moment, because we also we've ceded so much of any notion that the people or through their Congress have a right to change the Constitution, because Congress has to pass a constitutional amendment and then it goes to the states.
And hasn't for decades.
And where we're at now is one step significantly worse than that. It's not just that we've ceded that power exclusively to the Supreme Court. In fact, I think Americans do genuinely believe that if Trump says it's in the Constitution, it is, and if it isn't, it isn't. That somehow the president has the power to decide what the Constitution, that he's not obeying or not obeying, that he is the Constitution, right? The state is me, right? That is the kind of absurd political decay that we're in the midst of.
And can I just ask you about that from a broader historical perspective? I mean, we're seeing this retribution politics at the moment. We're seeing Trump, gloat about going after his enemies in the courts. We're, as you will have experienced yourself, we're seeing that huge fight with, say, Harvard. We're seeing, his attempt to sack somebody from the Federal Reserve Board. How unique or different is this in a historical perspective, and given everything you've studied, where does it end? How do we come out the other side?
Yeah, I don't know how it ends. I don't have good enough writing skills for that. People would point to and say the power of the presidency in this country has been expanding ever since FDR in the 1930s. FDR was confronting the Great Depression, war in Europe, the decline of democracy around the world, unbelievable suffering and unemployment in the United States, and passed a series of laws that he dubbed the New Deal. The Supreme Court began declaring those laws unconstitutional. FDR considered trying to constitutionalize those by way of a set of constitutional amendments, and was like, there's not enough time. We're in the middle of a depression. And he basically bullied the court into constitutionalizing the New Deal. You can think of what Trump is doing and quite self-consciously trying to take the United States back in time to before the New Deal, dismantling every agency of the federal government, every ability of the federal government to regulate the economy, enact and enable social and economic legislation, guarantee rights. Trump, even repealing the 16th Amendment, essentially, which was passed in 1913, which allows for a graduated federal income tax. That's why Trump likes tariffs better, right? He likes the 1890s and the 1900s. He is trying to dismantle what FDR's coalition began to put into place. That said, FDR was dealing with an actual crisis and a set of emergencies, and yet worked collaboratively with Congress. Trump, in his first 100 days, declared all these emergencies, took on all these emergency powers, issued all these emergency declarations. Congress passed no laws to do that. Really, it was all executive authority. And although, the notional commitment is we're dismantling the administrative state, this is not at all what they're doing, right? They're mantling a unitary executive authority.
Can I just ask you, Jill, to what extent the challenge exists? Because we know that Trump has signed more executive orders in his first 9 months than he did in his entire first administration. And actually, the record for executive orders is still held by FDR, who I think signed something like 3,900. And he would say that's because we were in the middle of World War II and the Depression and so on. But those executive orders that Trump has signed are challenged, aren't they, by the lower courts? And then they end up in the Supreme Court. And as far as I can tell, the Supreme Court in these so-called shadow dockets has voted in Trump's favor every single time. Explain that process to us, please.
Well, normally an administration, if it wanted to do something, whether it's by executive order or urging Congress to pass a law, would run it past lawyers. Say, do we have the authority to do this? Is this constitutional? Is this legal? Is this going to be struck down? And to some degree, Trump did that in his first term. Not always. I mean, there was and sometimes they're like, you can't do that. And so he didn't do it. But the decision this time around is no. I mean, and it's a very self-conscious strategy. Let's just do it all and get as far with doing it as we can. There'll be injunctions in the lower courts. Things will be stayed. We'll wait for it to work to its way to the upper courts. The Supreme Court has, as you suggest, has generally lifted the injunctions and said, well, we don't know yet if they can do it. One day we'll figure that out. But meanwhile, they can do it. That's basically been the game plan. Meanwhile, they can do it. And meanwhile means, right, people are being laid off, losing their jobs, children have no aid. There's, health insurance benefits are declining. At the moment, we don't really have anyone controlling where the planes are flying. When the next flood comes, no one's going to go to rescue children in their attic bedrooms. Meanwhile, that is a big meanwhile. Those are all caps.
Can it be undone?
Yeah, I mean, I remain hopeful that the Supreme Court is going to ultimately strike down more of this stuff than is expected. Waving it along, because I'm an optimist. I have no credible evidence.
That's a solid scientific basis, isn't it?
That's what I have. Yeah. I kind of have to believe, and I do believe some of this stuff will be reversed. And so some of the lower court decisions have been magnificent. Just in terms of the clarity of arguing against these abuses of power. But, there's a little bit of a question, like, what is going to be the thing? What would it take for the Supreme Court to say no? Like, what would the thing be? I think a lot of people think maybe that's going to be the birthright citizenship issue. It's hard to say. And I, kind of as a public commitment, I feel like it's important to say it's entirely possible that, there'll be a significant judicial pushback. And I wish I could say more than that's an act of hope.
What about the midterm elections? A question I keep getting from people on this side of the Atlantic is, especially from pessimists, surely the midterm elections will be cancelled. He'll find some kind of excuse. He'll stay in, he'll try and get re-elected for a third term in office. I mean, all that is really hard to achieve if you want to stick to the Constitution. But could he achieve it, and how?
There's no way to run for a third term constitutionally. That said, he could do it, and wait for the Supreme Court to wait it out. I don't think he will. I think he's physically failing, honestly. I think there's some significant signs that he's really on the decline. In terms of the midterms, I don't know. I will say, like, I'm not a big poll watcher. I would have said, just impressionistically, why would he bother canceling the midterms? I don't think the Democrats have really staged a significant opposition. I would like to think that there's going to be some seats shifting in the midterms, but
are you disappointed by that? Where is the fight back?
It's really weird. There's just not even. I teach at Harvard, as you say, and there's a lot. Obviously, the administration has been attempting to destroy our university. And you think about the scale of student protest over Gaza, 2-3 years ago, encampments, protests, meetings, constant meetings, and heartfelt, but a terrible tragedy in Gaza. But I would say for many students, it's a place they'd never heard of before, and their knowledge of it came from social media. And there are not students out in the campus quad right now protesting what the Trump administration is doing.
Does that surprise you? Does it disappoint you?
It does. There's not organized civil unrest, civil disobedience.
Like in the 60s.
Yeah, and you might say, well, then I can't protest Harvard. Harvard's like protesting on the campus again, with regard to Gaza is to protest Harvard, kind of call for divestment. What are they going to be? They're not protesting the university, but you can still protest. Like, just
why not? Why are they not doing that?
It really puzzles me. Or think about, even just smaller. You can understand why people are not able to protest ICE, the kind of crackdown, like the consequences of those kinds of protests, would be borne by the most vulnerable people.
The lack of the fight back is really striking.
It's really striking that there's not street action. That's not just like nonviolent,
especially compared to
protests
last
in the
time.
Streets. Yeah.
Can I just ask you one final one from me? You know a lot. You are fascinated by Elon Musk, aren't you? And his origin story. I know you've got a podcast on that. Just like, what is going on right now with him, do you think? And does he have any influence left?
He was in the news recently because at the memorial following the brutal assassination of Charlie Kirk, he and Trump apparently had a little chat. And so there was much like twittering about, are they making up? I think at the moment, he has been rewarded with untold gazillions by Tesla for making, I think, a little bit more of a commitment to stay out of the limelight and do more for the company. I think Musk is a good representative of the kind of political buffoonery, high celebrity, social media driven extremism that characterizes much of our political system and our political discourse right now. He is a creature of this. I think people sort of forget that Musk became the modern version of Musk immediately following the insurrection on January 6, 2021, when Trump was banned from social media. Remember, Trump had a huge Twitter following. He was the loudest voice on Twitter. And then essentially the day he was banned, Musk kind of stepped in and he became the loudest voice on Twitter. And it's like not long after that he decided he wanted to buy Twitter. I think they are kind of peas in a pod in an interesting way. And I think, both are truly enthralled to the idea of their own power and their unique importance. So it was unsurprising to me that they broke up. We have not seen the last of Elon Musk's attempts to interfere with national and international political arrangements, for sure. But they both similarly have no real concern for basic constraints on power that might allow for a more just world.
Just on that point, Jill, my final question to you would be this. There's a real seriousness to how Americans view their own republic, whether it's in the courts or in the newspapers, or in conversations, in the schoolyard and so on. And Trump seems to be riding roughshod over so much of that. And of course, half the country is applauding it and the other half is appalled by it. Where do you see the pushback to what many people regard as an existential battle for the future of the Republic coming? Where is it coming from? And will it succeed?
This book came out a few weeks ago, and I've been doing in between classes, jumping on planes and going around the country and talking to audiences about the Constitution. And it's a self-select, it's a book reading audience. It's like a very unusual group of people that come to these events, but it's usually a large number of people. And we spend a lot of time in Q&A. And I was in Seattle the other day, and the final question was essentially your question. Some guy said, geez, I don't know. At this point, I don't think we even really have a constitution, and I don't know how we defend what we have when no one else is, when our elected leaders aren't abiding by it and the courts seem to be unconcerned about it and we're not gathering in civil meetings to deliberate over it anymore. Maybe we just need to, take a completely different tack, like give up on the Constitution and come up with a different way of thinking about the future of this country. And I said, I really appreciate the question. Is a really good question. And so I thought, but what's this, 600 of us in this room, let's have a vote. So I called for like a voice vote of like, do you think we should fight for the Constitution that we have and repairing it and seeking means by which our elected officials honor it? Or do you think we should start again or whatever? And it was just a resounding aye to the first question. Like, people wanted to uphold the Constitution. So there is, among people that are going to go out of an evening to go here and talk about the Constitution, a kind of commitment to it that I was really struck by. I thought there would be much more of like, we basically need some fresh start. So I wish I had a prediction for you. I don't. I think there is a broad political middle in the United States that's often called the exhausted majority that just can't even participate in politics anymore because politics has become such a hideous playground.
It's the worst system apart from all the others, as Churchill said about democracy. There we go. Jill Lepore, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you both.
That was great from Jill Lepore. Really fascinating insights. That's it for this edition. Next week, I will be on a Roman holiday, and I mean literally on holiday in Rome. So, Anushka, the show is yours next week.
Yeah, because I don't take holidays, Matt. I work hard. Apart from, as you are surely going to point out, the one I've got coming up. Listen, I need you to help me out. Do get in touch with any questions you've got. You can email us on TrumpWorld@channel4.com or leave us a comment on YouTube or Spotify. And if I can't answer the questions, I'll just text you, Matt, on holiday. You don't mind, do you?
Of course you will. And maybe my phone will just have to malfunction for a bit. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Thanks to all of you for listening and taking part. That's it from Anushka and me. That's it from Trump World for another week.
See you next Wednesday.